So in the gospel reading, we now are in what is called the Mount of Olives discourse, or the Olivet discourse. If we look at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, it says this: Jesus left the temple, and again, this is during Holy Week. This is, I believe, on Wednesday of Holy Week. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And then verse 3 says, "As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the close of the age?'" So Jesus went to the Mount of Olives from leaving the temple area. We have been reading in chapter 23 the woes upon the Pharisees, which was given in the temple area. Now he goes outside of the city and he sits on the Mount of Olives, and he gives what is called the Mount Olivet Discourse. Notice to whom? To his disciples privately. So that also indicates to us that there was probably more people there crowded around Jesus than the 12 disciples. It's interesting when you go to Jerusalem and you go to the Mount of Olives, the thing that really struck me about the Mount of Olives is how close it is to the Temple Mount. And I mean, it's like you're right there. So I can imagine what that looked like. I mean, you see the gold dome of the mosque there now. Can't imagine being on the Mount of Olives and seeing the temple right there. I mean, you're just right there. And so, what is Jesus? How does he begin? He says, his disciples are pointing out the temple and probably the beauty of the temple, and he says, well, the temple's going to be destroyed. And then they get to the Mount of Olives, and he sits down, and they ask him, well, when will these things happen? And when will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And so Jesus puts these events together, which often happens in prophecy. Prophecy will often not tell us, well, this will happen, and then 20 years later this will happen, and 30 years later this will happen. No, it puts it all together. Like if you're looking at a mountain range, you don't see the mountains in between the taller mountain. It just puts everything together. Just like, again, when we read the Old Testament, we know, looking back, well, Jesus fulfilled this at his first coming. It just puts things together that Jesus fulfilled in his first coming, but then the rest will be fulfilled in his second. You see what I mean? It just puts the events all together. And Jesus puts them all together. He doesn't give a time frame. He doesn't say, well, in 70 AD, the Romans will destroy the temple, anything like that. He just answers their questions and puts it all together. How does that work with the destruction of the temple? Well, the way I look at it is that with the temple being destroyed in fulfillment of a prophecy Jesus is giving here, it should remind us that if that prophecy was fulfilled, then the other prophecies are going to be fulfilled too. And that often happens in prophecy. There'll be an immediate fulfillment, or pretty close fulfillment, to also give you the assurance that if that was fulfilled, then everything else is going to be fulfilled too in God's time. So when we look at the destruction of the temple, we see Jesus' prophecy being fulfilled, and it should, even though it was a horrible, horrible event, it should be an indication to us, if we needed that indication, that the signs of his coming and his coming again are assuredly to happen. Well, what does he tell us, or tells the disciples here in this portion of the Olivet Discourse? Stay awake. Boy, that would really preach, right, on a Sunday morning when people are falling asleep in the homily. Stay awake. That's just what the text says, right? Isn't that what we often have to do in our lives? We have to stay awake. Think in terms of your marriage. You have to stay awake. What does that mean? It means that you have to be intentional. Stay awake. When's the last time you told your spouse that you love them? When's the last time you've shown them a little act of love? Stay awake. And we obviously have to do this in our Christian life. Stay awake. Don't allow the routines of this world and the pressures of this world of work and raising a family and going to school. We get into these routines and it can just lull us to sleep. Stay awake. Jesus tells them, you stay awake because you don't know when I'll return. And he gives the story of a servant. First, a blessed servant, a servant that his master has gone away, but he's still busy with his task. Notice his task is to feed the other servants. Might that be an indication of what Jesus is tasking his disciples to do, the apostles? To feed his fellow servants, to feed them like a shepherd would feed the sheep, to feed them with the body and blood of Christ, to feed them with the Word of God. They're to care for the other servants. He knows that the master will return. He doesn't know when, but the important thing is that this blessed servant is faithful. Then there's another servant, a wicked servant. He does evil. And he says to himself, well, my master's not coming back for a long time. I can take it easy. I'll procrastinate and I'll put off what I know I'm supposed to do. So what does he do? He goes and he parties. He beats his other servant, his fellow servants. And then Jesus says, then the master comes back unexpected. Notice what he calls them, or what the place that he assigns the wicked servant. The place with there's that word again, hypocrites. Hypocrites. The ones that Jesus called the Pharisees, you're hypocrites. Why? Because you have an outward appearance of being righteous, but on the inside, you're like those sepulchres and tombs full of dead men's bones. Notice that there will be the wicked servant will be assigned to a place of torment. I don't think Jesus was giving an empty warning. I think the warning is real and true and valid. I don't think he's just trying to scare them, using psychology. If Jesus says there's potential for you and I, if we live as the wicked servant, that we could be put in a place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, then I think that's a real place. That is not an empty threat. So we have to take heed to not be like the wicked servant. And we should be like the blessed servant. We should remember that, as our psalm says, that 1,000 years in the Lord's sight is like yesterday. God is on his timing, not on our timing. And we can't have the attitude of, well, I don't know if Jesus will ever return, so I'm just going to live in the way that I want to live. We fall asleep spiritually if we do that. We become even wicked. So how are we to live? Well, we are to live in light of the fact that we will be held accountable to the Lord. It's more than, well, we don't want to be doing wicked and the Lord returns. It's like a billboard I saw years ago. Jesus is coming back again. Everybody look busy. You know, it's like when you get the DVD, right? Everybody, we're busy beavers. Well, no, it's not just that time. Yeah, I don't want to be doing something wicked when Jesus returns if I'm still here on the earth. But I'm going to be held accountable for my whole life. And that's what the wicked servant didn't factor. What about all that time that he acted wickedly? It's not just when the master comes back in that very moment, but aren't the other servants going to tell on him? I mean, he's going to be held accountable. So we need to stay awake and remember that we are going to be held accountable to our Lord. And that is not a negative thing. I think that's a good thing. We need those promptings. We need that initiative. We are human beings. And we need that type of inspiration, if you will, that we will be held accountable. And if we're held accountable and we're faithful, then he will reward us. So that should be our drive, our inspiration for what we do. We want to be pleasing to the Master. We want to hear, as Jesus said in another context, well done, good and faithful servant. I think he's going to say that in chapter 25, actually, doesn't he? That's who we're trying to please, the Master, and we seek to live for him. So you can't do that unless you stay awake. Stay awake. The Lord is going to return, and we will have to give an accounting of our lives and how we served him or how we did not. Lord, give us the grace to stay awake.